Welcome to the latest installment of Emory University's Health Storytelling Author Q&A series for 2023. I'm Maryn McKenna. I'm a journalist, an author, and senior fellow in the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University, and I'm the curator and host of this series. Welcome especially to everyone watching from the Atlanta Science Festival. We at the Center for the Study of Human Health are so thrilled to be joining forces with the festival and its more than 80 community partners who work to celebrate and expand science learning opportunities across Metro Atlanta. Thank you for your co-sponsorship. So in a moment, I'll introduce you to my guest in this installment, science journalist and podcaster Bethany Brookshire, and her amazing book, Pests: How Humans Create Animal Villains. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about this series. At least once per month during the academic year, we invite writers whose journalistic or academic books examine health, the science and history of health, or health's intersection with society. This series of conversations originates at Emory's Center for the Study of Human Health, and the entire year of installments is co-sponsored by the Georgia Center for the Book, an affiliate of the Library of Congress, and Science Gallery Atlanta, which presents exhibits that ignite creativity and discovery where art and science collide. The series is live streamed on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and archived on YouTube. And already this year, we've heard from Elena Conis, who presented her book, How to Sell a Poison: The Rise, Fall, and Toxic Return of DDT, published by Bold Type Books. And on April 12th, we'll talk to Stephen Thrasher, whose new book is The Viral Underclass: The Human Toll When Inequality and Disease Collide, published by an imprint of Macmillan. So one final note before I start talking to our guest. This is a live event and you can interact with us. We encourage you to do that. If you want to ask a question, please comment on any of the platforms where you are watching us, and our producer, Stefan Kaplan of Spin It Social, will make sure we see what you've said. Do note that I'll turn to your questions in the second half of this 60-minute live stream, but you can put your questions into your comment boxes at any time, and we hope you do. I'll remind you a couple of times that we want you to do that. Now, let's turn to our book and our guest. Bethany Brookshire is an award-winning freelance science journalist and the host of the podcast Science for the People. She was a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT in the year 2019-2020, and has a Ph.D. in Physiology and Pharmacology from Wake Forest University School of Medicine. She's a former staff writer at Science News and has been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Scientific American, The Washington Post, many other outlets. And she writes the newsletter Team Trash, where people and wildlife meet. Bethany, welcome to our series.
Thank you so much for having me, Maryn.
I am really excited to talk about your book, which, full disclosure, we should probably tell people, I got a chance to read it in advance, and there's actually a blurb for me on the back cover. So clearly I liked it, which is a great way to begin this conversation. So obviously we are friends, and I know some things about you that our audience doesn't yet, but now you're going to tell them. So let's start with why you and why this book? How did you come to this topic?
Yeah, I mean, why me? I don't know. I ask myself that question all the time. Like, am I really the person to write this book? And I feel like that's kind of an important question for like writers to ask themselves. So far, I'm still a tentative yes that I should have written the book. We'll find out. But yes, the idea for the book, I have been noodling about pests since honestly about 2016. So my major inspiration came from a paper that I read published in Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences in 2016. And it was an archaeological group in Israel that found the oldest evidence for commensal mice, for mice living with people. And what they found were tiny, tiny little mice teeth, because of course. And the animals were living in some of the first human settlements. These were the original huts and rock shelters that people first started living in when they started giving up hunter-gatherer lifestyles. Crucially, they built these houses before agriculture.
Hmm.
So they were still hunter-gatherers, they were just more sedentary, and kind of transitioning toward farming. And the instant they had houses, they had house mice. And I loved that so much. I loved that these animals saw this change and saw the opportunity immediately from the earliest points of settled human life. That just really, really spoke to me. And then I started pulling together more stories of pests just from around the world, of different animals that have come to live very closely with us, sometimes too closely. And I was just so struck over time by how these are often the most common wildlife in our lives. And oh, how we hate them. We hate them so much. And I love that. So I wanted to write a book about what these animals really are and why we hate them so much. Because in the end, it's not about them. They are just living their best lives. It is about us and what we believe and what we want out of the places we live.
It sounds like this is a good time to ask you to tell us the story of Kevin.
Kevin. Can I cuss on this podcast? Can I? No? Yes. We'll go with non-cussing just in case.
Probably wise.
Yeah. So his full name is freaking Kevin. It's not actually his name. You know what his name is. And Kevin is Sciurus carolinensis. He is a eastern gray squirrel. He lives in my backyard. And to be fair, there's probably about 20 Kevins. Like it's a squirrel mafia. It's a large population of squirrels living in my backyard. And I hate this squirrel with the fire of 1,000 suns. I hate him so much. He is he is the reason I have not had a tomato from my garden in 5 years.
Reasonable to hate.
Yeah, because every year I go and I plant tomatoes, and every year they grow and they become green and they swell up, and I'm like, yes. And then Kevin comes in and he takes a big old bite out of the nicest tomato in the garden, and then he remembers that he does not actually like tomatoes.
Uh-oh.
So he just leaves it on my porch, right where I can see it. And then the next day, he comes and he does it again and again and again. He has done this to every single tomato in my garden for 5 years running. I have been unable to prevent him, and I have tried many, many things. And it became such a wonderful example of an animal that, to other people, I have friends who love squirrels, right? Everybody likes squirrels. And to other people, squirrels are these cute, charming, urban wildlife, all this kind of stuff. And to me, it's just, they're awful. Yes, yes. Thank you, Renee. Squirrels are just rats with good PR and fashion sense. And it just really brought home to me how much pests are a matter of perspective and a matter of what we want out of our lives. I want tomatoes, and it is Kevin's job to make sure I will never have any.
Especially since it seems that Kevin doesn't really want tomatoes himself.
You know, he's not even doing it for him. It'd be okay if he ate the whole thing. He had a whole delicata squash last year, and I was like, you know what? You go. You do that.
So inherent in what you just said, and you did say it, but I'm going to pull it out of you a little bit more, is that so much of what we construe as our relationships with the animals at the fringes of our lives is really a matter of context. People might love the squirrels until the squirrels come along and eat their gardens, or people might love cats until the cats come along and eat the birds in their gardens, if the cats do. I understand that's disputed. That's something you get into in the book. But this question of, nothing is good or ill, but thinking makes it so, particularly for animals, is really fascinating.
Yeah, that was one of the big things that really came through for me, is how much we love these animals until we don't. And there are so many like reasons behind that. So for example, we often love these animals until they challenge our sense of power, our sense of control over our environments, right? We plant a whole garden full of tomatoes and we feel very in control and at one with nature until nature decides to come eat our tomato. We often also end up labeling animals a pest when we lose our use for them. So, for example, they fill a niche in our lives. Niche. I still haven't worked that one out. And mice have always kind of been pests. We've never really enjoyed them. And that was their original niche. It was to be a pest to us until we decided to take the mouse and make it the laboratory mouse. And now, because it was a pest, we felt okay making it the laboratory mouse. And now it has an even more essential niche as an animal that is incredibly important and has saved millions of lives. Conversely, we started out deliberately domesticating the pigeon, which is one of my favorite pests. Don't tell the others. And we domesticated the pigeon because we had a use for it. We used it for fertilizer. We used it for messengers. And we used it for food. We ate it. And then we developed chemical fertilizer. We developed cell phones. And we developed chicken. And the pigeon lost its use. And we let it go. And then once it no longer had a niche, it took up another niche as a pest in our cities. And now we hate it. And it's so fascinating to watch people's opinions change as the context of the animal changes. In the end, those animals are doing exactly what they have always done. They are going out, they are getting food, they are coming back, they are making more of themselves, right? What changed is the context of how they did it. And I find that just so abundantly fascinating.
And we should say here, for people who have not yet had the opportunity to read the book, but we're going to tell you at the end of this live stream how you can buy it, and you should, is that these pet versus pest or love versus loathe animals are not just ones that we can hold in our hands, right? They're not just squirrels. They're not just mice. They're not just cats. They're also charismatic megafauna. Animals that are international darlings, that are the subject in some cases of major preservation campaigns, but also can be deeply problematic when they intersect with the fringes of human society.
Yeah. I have a whole chapter on African elephants, which, people love. I love elephants. I went to Kenya to report the chapter and I got to meet African elephants, as it were. And oh my goodness, they're stunning. They're stunning. They're beautiful. They're beautiful. They're so human-like in so many ways. They're obviously intelligent. I mean, there's just charismatic does not begin to describe these animals. And yet, the people who live with them suffer millions of dollars in crop damages, and 200 people per year die because of these animals. And to us in the West, the global North, elephants could never be a pest. They are beautiful. They are endangered. They are precious. But to the people who live with them, it's a very different story. They suffer from what we call human wildlife conflict. And there's lots of reasons behind that. We can get into some of the reasons as a hint, some of it's colonialism. In fact, all of it's colonialism, but we don't necessarily have to get into that if you would rather not. But it's really fascinating to see how even animals that we value can descend in our eyes when they start to cause us harm or harm to the things we value. Another example of charismatic megafauna is the black bear, which I have a whole chapter on. Wolves in North America. We love wolves when they are far away, when they are distant, when they are in beautiful, pristine, human-free environments. But when you have places like Wisconsin, wolf populations are being severely curtailed, right? They held the first wolf hunt in 2021, and they blew past the target by more than 60% in a mere 3 days. They killed 218 wolves in 3 days. And it was because the animals, there were too many, they were too close for comfort. And it's just really fascinating to see how even the animals we worship and we respect can fall in our esteem the instant they threaten what we value.
So we're going to talk about those threats in just a minute, but I want to remind first everyone who's watching us on all the platforms where you're watching us that we really welcome your questions and comments. Some are already stacking up, and I will turn to them after the first 30 minutes of this, but please feel free to comment at any time. One person has asked, before we turn away from the depredations of squirrels, whether you have seen the Squirrel obstacle course, which
have
apparently
I
involves
ever?
the trebuchet.
Mark Rober's obstacle course. Yes, I love it. Oh, it's so good. It's also very funny. It was something I was thinking about. We often think, oh man, I can't believe they used to have like animals performing tricks in sideshows. People would do anything for entertainment before modern media. And now I realize it's 2023 and we're watching squirrel obstacle courses on YouTube. We have changed not at all.
Hmm.
But yes, his squirrel obstacle course, he's a NASA engineer who has made it his life mission to create the most amazing obstacle course for squirrels. They are utter geniuses at it, and it's so good to watch.
So taking a more serious turn away from the squirrel trebuchets, which I am going to go look up as soon as we're done. Folks will try to get you the link for it. This question of threat and when animals pose a threat to us, especially the animals that are close to us, maybe even animals that we valued. Since this is a series about health and the science of health and its intersection in society, I want to talk about disease threats specifically. And inherent, I think, in this notion of animals as pests is the sense that animals are dangerous, and that danger comes because they are sort of on the fringe of our world, though we might be concerned from where we sit here on the east coast of America with wolves or with elephants. What's impacting us directly is mice and rats and deer. Can you talk a bit about pest animals that we construe as pests as a source of diseases, and how we think about fencing our lives off from them if we can?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. But one of the things that I ended up discussing in my book that I think is really relevant here is the way that we view many animals we call pests with disgust. And I ended up actually kind of going on this wonderful deep dive of what disgust is. Because it turns out disgust is one of the basic emotions, which is not a way to simplify it down, because some people say there are like 4 basic emotions and some people say there are 12. So it's one of them. And disgust is a very important emotion to humans, and not just to humans. Other animals also exhibit disgust. And disgust is amusingly and rather Freudianly defined by some scientists as oral rejection.
Hmm.
It's very Freudian, I know. But basically, the idea is you're trying to keep things that can make you sick out of your body, right? And so the universal face of disgust is basically, get it out. Often there's a gagging noise. Sometimes there's actual throwing up. And the whole idea is you're trying to get an infectious thing away from you. And so disgust as an emotion, the idea goes, evolved so that we could prevent ourselves from getting sick, right? We don't eat poop because we are unattracted to poop. We find poop disgusting because it could make us sick. What's interesting about disgust is that it then expands as an emotion to other things. So then you say, okay, well, what things are associated with poop, right? And what I found in a lot of my historical research is that rats were actually not associated with disgust for a very long time, until about the 18th century. People did not like them. They were absolutely pests. People did not like them, but they were not disgusted by them. And there was this idea that rats might be, in terrible things like horse poo and stuff like that, but they themselves were weirdly clean. And I don't really know where this idea came from, but they managed to actually kind of separate the idea of rats and disgust until the 18th century, when you had the widespread adoption of underground sewer systems and the
Hmm.
widespread influx of the brown rat, the Norwegian rat. And the brown rat loves itself some sewers. And then you could no longer ignore it doesn't matter how clean that rat looks. If it's coming out of a sewer, oh, we're done. But it's really interesting to see disgust as an emotion has expanded from the poop to the sewer to the rat. And then it becomes expanded again to people associated with that animal,
Hmm.
right? And it's not just true for rats. People who live with rats are seen to live in filth, they are seen to be unclean. People who have a lot of pigeons, particularly people who feed pigeons,
Hmm.
are often seen to be disgusting because pigeons are gross and cause disease. Um, you know, pigeons do cause disease, not near as much as farmed domesticated birds, but they do. And so it's been interesting to see that disgust expand. And then it expands into what they call moral disgust, right? There's this idea that you say, I am disgusted by this because I am not like that. I do not wish to be associated with homelessness, for example. What I found in my research, people who suffer the most from rats, in particular, are unhoused people because they cannot get away from those animals. There are people living in severe poverty. They may have a roof over their head, but a lot of times it is not impermeable and they suffer from many pests, not just rats. Many of the people I interviewed who, for example, feed large flocks of urban pigeons are unhoused.
Hmm.
And people then expand the disgust of the animal to the person associated with it. Um, and it was really fascinating to see that expansion of disgust when people do not choose to live that way, right? Rats don't
So,
even choose to live that way.
so what you're saying is that the identification of animals as pests, as dangers, especially as disease dangers, that's sort of a pointer toward a social justice issue.
Yep. Yep. Pests are often a problem of social justice. And I actually wrote in my book, rats are disgusting because people are, because we are bad to each other. Where rats proliferate, it is often where the social contract has broken down, where people are not adequately served by sanitation, where people do not have adequate housing, or where people don't have housing at all. Animals become seen as a sign of social disorder because they are a sign that we are not taking adequate care of each other. And that's not just rats. I mean, it is for rats for disgust, for example, but human elephant conflict is a sign of people not taking care of each other, right? Human wolf conflict also.
I want to point out that someone who's listening, Lauren Palacio, asks whether the terrain in which animals live have an effect on how much of a pest they're able to be. And I think you're describing some of that.
Absolutely. Yes, that's a very good question. And yes, it does. A lot of times I found this really interesting thing in my research that we may get to. It's not really related to health, but it's a matter of definition. The West, humans in the West, often perceive the concept of wilderness as an area where people are not,
Mhm.
right? And human landscapes, conversely, are landscapes in which animals are not, unless we
Hmm.
invite them in, unless we want them. Like we want robins and squirrels and cats, those are the animals we want. And when those two areas mix, when wilderness and human areas mix, that is what makes us uncomfortable. And it makes us uncomfortable because we form this harsh dividing line between what is natural and what is not. And so, for example, when she's talking about terrain, a good example of that is the human wildland interface, particularly in places like the area surrounding Los Angeles, which has one of the largest human wildland interfaces in the United States. And you end up with this long-term interaction of animals that have lived in those wildlands forever, and now people are living in those lands, and they see it as a human landscape. But the animals just see it as the place they have always lived. And so you end up with people panicking over coyotes in their neighborhoods, and calling those animals a pest and wanting them killed. And that has a great deal to do with the terrain that they've moved into.
I want to be sure that we pop up here a comment from Rachel Hull Clifford, who's faculty at Emory, about how an anthropologist has characterized the definition of dirt.
Yes. And you know what? I am so glad. I feel like it's my favorite thing when people read my book for the first time and they're like, I'm getting shades of Mary Douglas. And I was like, yes, she's right back here on my bookshelf. And she does end up getting a quote specifically for that. Mary Douglas is an anthropologist who defined dirt as matter out of place. People have since defined weeds as plants out of place. And I have defined pests as animals out of place. But that begs the question, who decides place? We do. It is us who determine that dirt, that plant, that animal is out of place. Who died and made us king?
So I want to go back to something that you hinted at a moment ago, but we raced right past it. And that was when we were discussing the question of the animals that we associate with disease or with dirt or with threat. Are we unfairly blaming them? Is there more threat from the animals that we've allowed into our houses or allowed onto our farms? Do we shift the responsibility for threat from domesticated animals to wilder ones?
That's a good question. I think the actual magnitude of the threat, I think actually you're the better person to answer that question than me. Because you're the specialist in this and I am not. But certainly in some of the articles that I've read, I would say the threats are similar. Certainly it is pigs and birds, most particularly like turkeys and chickens, that give us flus. I believe smallpox is a zoonotic disease from livestock. Livestock and pets also, toxoplasmosis is one we get from cats. These are diseases that we get from the animals that we love, right? And I think they're probably pretty similar from the diseases that we get from the animals we don't love. The difference is who we blame, right? When we get diseases from our livestock, we blame each other. Right? We say, oh, you're not keeping we need to surveil better. We need to, keep our chickens in more clean environments. We need to, do all these things. You need to vaccinate your dog. You need to, do all this. When we receive diseases from wild animals, particularly animals that we already don't like, we blame them and we eradicate them. And it's mostly because we don't like them. A good example of this, for example, is they're having a pretty big outbreak, well, big is relative, of leptospirosis in California. And leptospirosis is a bacterial infection that can spread from infected pee and poo, etc., and is often spread by rodents. Okay, that includes rats, it includes ground squirrels, it includes a bunch of other things. The people who end up suffering from leptospira are not humans, they are dogs. And dogs can then spread it elsewhere. But it's also very deadly for the dogs. Our solution to this is not to say, oh God, the dogs are spreading leptospirosis, we should kill the dogs. No, the solution is to vaccinate the dogs and kill all the rats. And I'm not saying that's the wrong solution. It may be the right solution, but it definitely shows who gets the blame for a disease that both of these animals are actually suffering from.
It's a really fascinating example. I want to turn, since we're just about 30 minutes through, I have many more questions for you, but there are a couple of really interesting things that people have said. Maya Trujillo comments that in Tanzania, in some communities, flies are not actually seen as pests. They're actually seen as beneficial animals, which I think goes to your your point earlier of that whether we love or loathe an animal depends on the construction that we put on that animal as much as on qualities inherent to the animal.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. I personally, unfortunately, cannot comment on flies because there are only vertebrates in this book. Um, and I did do that for a reason. But if you would like to read more about flies, may I recommend Dawn Beeler's book, Pests in the City, which is specifically about the intersection between a bunch of pests and social justice. She was very influential in my thinking on this topic, and her book is really, really good. So please go check that one out. But yeah, it really shows how animals can have very different connotations, depending on culture, depending on relationships, and depending on what we know about them, right? If the only thing you know about rats, for example, is that they spread plague, you're not going to react well to rats, right? If you know rats as cuddly, as smart, you will react very differently when you see one.
I think it's important at this point, before we slide away from the topic of diseases originating with or transiting through animals, that we acknowledge that we have been, for the past 3 years, in a worldwide pandemic, a worldwide epidemic, a big thing, of a zoonotic disease, a disease that spread from animals to humans, and certainly not the only one. And in this particular case, and in the case of SARS-1, 20 years ago, they were, for the most part, animals that were somewhat mysterious to many of the people who were affected by the disease. They were unfamiliar. They were on the fringe of the wild world. They weren't cats and dogs. Is there anything you want to say about that? You must have thought about it.
I have. What I actually want to say is slightly different, and it may be something that we'll
Please.
get to. Um, One of the things I found really fascinating about the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic is how we've reacted when the virus has jumped back to other species.
Hmm.
So because it jumps back to other species, and I have lots of thoughts on why that happens, but one of the species it has jumped back to that's been receiving headlines, actually just last week, I think, is that, oh no, the rats in New York
Hmm.
have SARS-CoV-2 now. And for a while, a long time, they didn't have it, but they do now. And people are like, oh no, this means that the pandemic's going to stick around forever. This is terrible. We've got to do something about these rats. So way back in 2020 now, SARS-CoV-2 first expanded to white-tailed deer,
Hmm.
which live very close to humans. They probably expanded because people feed deer, and we can get more into that when we talk about ecosystem health, because I got a lot to say about that. And people immediately were like, well, are the deer getting sick? Oh no,
Hmm.
we don't want the deer to get sick. Are all the deer going to get it? Is it going to kill the deer? That was what people worried about. Can the deer then affect humans? No one said we have to do something about all these deer. They were worried, but no one said we need to get rid of the deer. Whereas when it jumps back to rats, everyone says, oh, well, obviously we need to get rid of the rats.
But isn't it the case that for other diseases, I'm thinking of Lyme disease, for instance, that there have been attempts to get rid of the deer? People have said, oh, deer are involved in the life cycle of Lyme disease in my suburb, and so
Yes.
we need to reduce the deer population. Although I think
Oh
mice
my
also
goodness.
play a role. Please go ahead. I see you're
So
getting excited by this.
I am so excited because this is a whole section that I wrote that did not make it into the book for various reasons, mostly having to do with length. But it's really fascinating. So you'll often come across, problems with Lyme disease, where people will say, yes, we need to reduce the number of deer. This tends to get a huge amount of pushback, like huge, to the point that on Martha's Vineyard, okay, they have a large population of deer. They have actually agreed to a project out of MIT that will genetically alter the mice on Martha's Vineyard so that they cannot carry Lyme disease to the deer, because they would rather They would honestly rather genetically alter an entire population of island mice over a period of a decade and a half than get rid of the deer on Martha's Vineyard. The deer, by the way, are not native to Martha's Vineyard. They were brought there. They were brought there about 100, maybe 50 years ago now. So they haven't even been there very long. But it's just the lengths that people will go to not kill the deer are just fascinating to me. And they really also show who people are glad to blame, right? And also who they're willing to have suffer the consequences, right? The people of Martha's Vineyard could also wear long socks and cut back the undergrowth and put on bug spray, but they won't.
So I want to point out at this point that one of our listeners, thank you, is asking to what degree human suppression of populations or human interference in the balance of populations makes a difference to the kind of interventions that you're talking about.
Oh, that is such a big question. Oh my goodness. Yes, it does. On so many levels. Yes and no and both. It depends on the species. There's so many going on. But we are talking about deer, so we can continue to talk about deer. Part of the reason that Lyme disease has gained such a foothold in the Northeast has a great deal to do with the very large populations of deer. And part of that issue is due to the huge comebacks that deer have made on the eastern seaboard. Deer have made those comebacks for two reasons. One, we stopped hunting them. Hunting numbers are still going down. But two, well, three reasons actually. We stopped hunting them. Two, we killed all the wolves. That was an issue. That's a pretty big issue. But the biggest issue is one that I think most people don't see. The vast majority of the East Coast is forest. And it is forest that did not used to exist. People really don't realize. And they're like, no, I live in a suburb. If your suburb has mature trees, you live in a forest. You live in a forest that has plenty of edges, like nice bushy undergrowth edges. Deer love nice bushy undergrowth edges. And so we've created this very large, useful habitat for deer. And in the Lyme disease life cycle, deer are where they get all of their energy. That's where they get all of their first blood meals before they end up going to humans, which they mostly do by accident. So yeah, I mean, we have kind of failed at population control of deer. And this is actually impacting not just us and how often we get Lyme disease. And I've had Lyme disease and it is terrible and I do not recommend it. It impacts the health of the deer themselves. So we know, for example, that deer are becoming overpopulated to the point that we are getting epidemic diseases in deer. And that's not just SARS-CoV-2. That is also chronic wasting disease, CWD, which is spread by deer sniffing at each other's fluids, which is a thing that deer do. I'm so glad that humans aren't like really into, sniffing things.
Moving along.
Sorry. But anyway, so CWD, EHD, which is a hemorrhagic disease in deer. All of these things are exacerbated by extreme deer overpopulation. There's a great example of this happening in Wisconsin, where in the southern half of the state, there are no wolves. There are very high numbers of deer, and they have spreading chronic wasting disease. It actually stops about halfway up the state where the wolf populations begin, because the wolf populations are picking off the weak and the sick. And so it's interesting that, yeah, it's been a failure of our management of this population that has produced not just Lyme disease for us, but diseases for the deer themselves.
So this is a good moment to slide into this question of ecosystem health, whether or not that's directly a discussion of human health, because this is something that I want to hear much more about. And there's a thing that you said to me when we were getting ready to do this that I just cannot get out of my mind, partly because I wrote about this recently myself. And this is the question of of ecosystem change and invasive species. I wrote a piece recently about the invasive species with 4 feet, feral hogs, and how they are spreading across the US.
I'm so jealous you wrote about it before I did.
It was
So
such
jealous.
a fun story to do. But there are plenty of other invasive species for you to write about, and some of them are in the book, like the Everglades, the Burmese pythons. But what you said to me that I can't get out of my head is that we talk about invasive species. We don't talk about climate refugees, but that's what some animal invasive species are. And that, of course, is anthropogenic, right?
Yeah, actually, so we do talk about climate refugees in some contexts. And I use this example in the book there. So, for example, there's a salamander on the East Coast, and it is steadily moving north with climate change. And people are cheering for the salamander. They're like, yeah, you can do it. Go north, young man. You can make it. And they call that animal a climate refugee. It's fleeing north in response to climate change. And people say, oh, well, it's fine because these animals, they're not having negative impacts on their ecosystems. This is a salamander. We don't actually know. Like, it's just arrived. So people will tell me the difference between an invasive species and a climate refugee is that the climate refugee is not having a negative impact. We don't know that. The second thing they say is, well, the invasive species is evil because humans brought it there. And therefore, it has no right to succeed in this environment. It would never naturally succeed here. And that is fair in some ways, but it's also really interesting to think about because I do have a whole chapter on the Burmese python in the Florida Everglades. I got to go hunting for Burmese pythons in the Everglades. Magical. So great. But one of the things I found really fascinating is that Burmese pythons are originally from Southeast Asia, where they are threatened. They are in very low numbers. They are rare in Southeast Asia. And that is because people hunt them for their skin. They make nice bags out of them, that sort of thing. People hate them in the Everglades and hunt them for sport. We did bring them to the Everglades. But in a way, aren't they kind of habitat refugees? Like, they're threatened by the destruction of their habitat and hunting in Southeast Asia. And they're making it in Florida, and we're mad. Because they are making it, of course, by eating the native fauna, which is, an issue. But it's really interesting to see how our own judgments of who should succeed where, who has a right to succeed in this ecosystem, is a judgment that we're making. We're saying some animals can move into new ecosystems with climate change, and they're going to have impacts in those ecosystems, and we're going to cheer them on because they're climate refugees. But if we bring an animal somewhere else and they succeed, we get real mad real quick.
So some of that question of ecosystem health and the degree to which we are willing to engage in helping to manage an ecosystem that we perceive as getting out of balance involves going in and killing animals, as you mentioned the Wisconsin wolf hunt a little while ago. And so where do we draw the line, if there's a single line to be drawn, with deciding which animal is a pest and whose side we're on?
It's a tough question. It's a philosophical question. I think it's an ethical question. I personally highly recommend Emma Maris's book, Wild Souls, Freedom and Flourishing in the Non-Human World. It just came out in paperback actually this week. So yay. And she actually takes a philosophical lens to this question, and I think does a wonderful job with it. Because a lot of times we do not hesitate when a population of rats arrives on an island and starts threatening an endangered seabird population. We will drop tons of poison to destroy 1,000 rats to save 100 seabirds, and we do it without hesitation. And that is an ethical judgment that we have made, and it is based on the idea that biodiversity is an inherent good. That biodiversity is the most important thing for conservation, and that the rats are too common and the birds are not common enough, and so the rats must die. I don't know what the right answer is there, but I do think it's a question we need to ask. And it's a question we don't ask. We just reach for the poison because they are rats. And I think that's something we need to think a little harder about, especially as we start to see the impacts of those poisons on those ecosystems, where rats are not the only thing. We're not dealing with just two species here. And it's also worth asking whether our culling of populations, which we do with deer, which we do with horses, which we try to do with feral hogs with very little success, which we try to do with Burmese pythons with no success whatsoever, are either sustainable or something that we even should be doing. I mean, are there other ways to deal with this? These are ethical questions that I think we need to ask ourselves. I can't answer them personally. I'm just like walking away from that one.
So this is a good point at which to bring in another comment from someone who's watching. Thank you so much. Lauren Palacio asks this for an ideal scenario. Is there a way to cohabit with pests? She was asking particularly about our discussion about spreading disease from pest animals, but how do we draw these balances, or how do we allow these balances to emerge if we're not actively managing ecosystems so that we make the world safe for all?
Yeah, so I think in some ways, part of that comes from the acceptance that we will never be safe. We have this sense of entitlement that we deserve to be safe in all of our environments, that we deserve to go hiking in mountain lion territory with a chihuahua on a leash. And I'm sorry, you're walking a coyote snack right there, man. Like you earned that. And I think there's some ways in which we just need to take on that risk, and we need to see it as worthwhile if we want to live in natural environments. And it's not even if we want to. We do live in natural environments. We live with these animals. At the same time, though, there are ways to cohabitate without spreading disease. Just because I'm not saying kill every rat, but please, let's improve our sanitation. Right? Like, let's not just welcome them with open arms. One of the best ways to cohabit with animals that live off of us, such as rats, is to reduce their food supply. Right? We could improve our sanitation. We could provide housing to people who need it, secure housing that they can then keep clean and free of pests. We can control the habitat around us, such as chopping down bushes and lots of like high grassy things that deer like to eat. We can control that. There are many ways that we can change ourselves and how we live in the world that would reduce the impacts that these animals have on us. We can reduce populations of deer to reduce the spread of Lyme, but we can also cut down that brush, right? We can reduce populations of rats, but we can also increase our sanitation. We can reduce pigeon feeding, right? But also accept that you're always going to have some pigeons, and that's fine.
In your research, did you come across any societies that actually have successfully managed or begun to manage their interactions with what they think of as pest animals? Are there models out there that other places could follow?
Absolutely, there are. Yes. So I was very, very lucky, and I got to learn from many indigenous groups around the world, but particularly indigenous groups from North America. And I was really struck by how differently they view their participation in ecosystems, right? We might say, the more scientifically minded among us might say that, of course, we're all part of the ecosystem. We don't act like it. We don't deep down in our bones believe it. But many of the people who I learned from do. They are part of the ecosystem in which they live. And that means they have a responsibility to cohabitate with the animals they live with. And my favorite example of this is actually cohabitation with black bears,
Hmm.
the Great Bear Rainforest in British Columbia. I spoke with the chief counselor of the Kitasoo Heihei. His name is Douglas Niesloss. He's really cool. And he told me that there was a time in which they were having problems with black bears coming into their village. And black bears on the West Coast get big. They're real big. They are chunky boys. And they were coming into the village and they were spreading trash around and they were starting to be a danger to the people who lived there. And so he said at first they called the government because that's what you're supposed to do. You call the federal government. And in this case, I think they called the province. And the province came in and shot the bears. And the Kitasoo Heihei were like, absolutely not. You did what now? Because to them, the bears are a very important part of their culture. And the government said, well, that's our mandate. Like, if you call us in, we have to shoot. And Douglas and the other members of the Kitasoo Heihei basically said, well, then you are not welcome here anymore.
Wow.
We will never call you again. And they got together as a village and they said, okay, what are we going to do? And as part of asking what they're going to do, they turned to their traditional ecological knowledge. And they said, what about the way we are living have we changed that has coincided with the arrival of these bears? And the answer was trash. Trash and fruit trees. Have been growing gardens and fruit trees. They also had a salmon cannery that was not as well cleaned up as it should be. And so they invested, and everybody in the entire village got a bear-proof trash can. They all got bear bins. Everything that is remotely like food goes in the bear bin. They cleaned up the cannery. It is active only at certain times of year. And they pulled up every single fruit tree in the village. And they have no problems with bears anymore.
And they were willing to take those losses to not only to do the extra work of making sure that they got rid of their garbage appropriately, but to actually change the landscape that they'd created in order to make room for these animals. Yeah.
And I think if we saw the ecosystems we lived in as more important, maybe we'd be more willing to make those changes too. Right? We don't have to accept the way that we currently deal with our trash. we don't have to live the way that we do. It is a choice that we make, and we could make different choices if we wanted to value things differently.
So we're getting into the last couple of minutes of this, and this has just been delightful. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it tremendously. So what I'd like to do just in these last minutes is for you to talk a little bit more sort of about what you're talking about right now, about looking toward the future. Can we reframe our relationship to animals such that we either we don't consider them pests, or we put a bit more respect on them and make a bit more room for them, or we change our lives a bit? Do you actually see any hope of that on a broad scale?
I kind of do a little bit.
Good.
So in, my research and talking with people, I was talking with Neil Patterson. He is an elder of the White Bear clan of the Tuscarora, I'm pretty sure. And we were talking about ecosystems and traditional ecological knowledge. And he said, we actually have this prophecy that eventually people are going to come to us and seek our knowledge, and that we will share our knowledge. And he goes, people are coming. People are coming. They are asking about traditional ecological knowledge in a way they never did before. He said, I see this happen, and I'm beginning to think maybe we can make changes. And I think that's one of the things that's really important, is to talk to the people who have been living in these ecosystems the longest, because they see and know so much. There is so much knowledge. And much of it is very scientific. A lot of times scientists will come in and, do studies to see whether something is actually the case. And they will find that, yes, actually the indigenous people were correct. And I think it's really worth doing more of that and asking people about that. But it's also interesting to see that change in perspective. A lot of that knowledge comes from a willingness to see yourself as part of an environment, to see a wilderness as a place with people in it, to see a human-dominated environment as an ecosystem, and an ecosystem that has its own value. One of the things that I found really fascinating is that I got to talk to a bunch of religious scholars. Um, it was great. I bet these people are fantastic at parties. My kind of parties. But I talked with a lot of biblical scholars, and a lot of conservationists put blame on things like Genesis.
Sure, fill the earth and subdue it, right?
Yes, dominate the earth. And certainly in Western cultures, there is this sense of dominion, that we have the right, that we are entitled to do with the earth as we see fit. And one of the things that I really learned from a lot of the indigenous people I talk to is they give themselves a little less credit and they give the animals around them a little more. And they say, we all have a right to be here. One of my favorite quotes was from Joseph Marshall III, who is an elder in the Rosebud Sioux. And he said, with regard to coexistence with wolves, he said, that did not mean we were always pleased with each other, but we always respected each other's right to be. And I really appreciated that idea, the idea that we could live with some of these animals and acknowledge them as neighbors. And that does not mean that you're always pleased with them, but it means that you respect their right to be there. And that changes the way that you behave. When you are living with someone and you consider them your neighbor, you're going to be much more tolerant of the things they do than if you're living with someone and you consider them an interloper into your life.
That is a perfect thought to end on. Thank you so much. This was a delightful conversation. So that's it, audience, for this edition of the Health Storytelling Author Q&A series, this time with Bethany Brookshire, author of Pests, How Humans Create Animal Villains. Please consider following Bethany on social media. You can see her handle, B Brookshire, should be on the screen any moment, and buy her book. You can also find all of her journalism at her website, bethanybrookshire.com. Her book is from Ecco, an imprint of Harper Collins. And so you can buy the book from her publisher. You can find it at Amazon, of course, and you can find it at bookshop.org. And it's also available at your local brick and mortar bookstore, wherever that may be. And if you follow the link that we provide for indiebound.com, that site will show you which independent bookstore near you is carrying Bethany's book. So one more instance of this series in this academic year. Please join us on April 12th. When I talk to Stephen Thrasher about his just amazing book, The Viral Underclass, The Human Toll When Inequality and Disease Collide. This is, Stephen was going to come talk to us last fall. He had to reschedule. We're so happy that he could come into the spring edition of this series instead. Once again, we are incredibly grateful to join the Atlanta Science Festival as part of their 2-week celebration of science and STEM in Atlanta. Thank you, all of you who came to this live stream through the Atlanta Science Festival's links. We're grateful to our co-sponsors, the Georgia Center for the Book and Science Gallery Atlanta, and the originator of this series and our host, Emory's Center for the Study of Human Health. So, until next time, I'm Maryn McKenna on behalf of all of those co-sponsors and co-producers. And for me personally, thank you for watching. Go buy a book.